Today, I'm cutting through the noise when it comes to group classes, and I'm tackling some of that classic advice that you may have heard, and I'm turning it around on its head because I want you to walk away from this episode with actionable tips that will actually help you sell your group classes and fill those spaces. So, before I dive in, if you have your phone handy, I just have one small request. Please do hit the follow or subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. Right, with that out of the way, let's dive in. Welcome to the Upgrade Your Education Business podcast. I'm your host, Samantha, and I'm so pleased you're here. As an education business owner myself and a former teacher, I understand the nuances that only apply to us. So in this podcast, I share fluff-free, tailored and actionable ideas that you can mould to suit your needs. If you'd like to take this conversation further, please do reach out. I would love to meet you. And finally, it would mean the world to me if you could leave a review. That way, you'll be helping me help more people. Thank you for tuning in. Enjoy. There's a common perception that the reason why group classes don't sell is because parents prefer one-to-one lessons. Now, in some cases, that may be true. But the most important thing to consider here is why. Why are they saying they prefer one-to-ones? Now, sometimes it's because that's just how it's always been done. It's the most traditional form of tuition. And so they assume that that's the way it should be, that that's the best way of learning. Sometimes tutors promote that message. They promote that nothing beats a one-to-one lesson. Sometimes it's because it's their preference, they're leaning towards a bias. Sometimes it's because they don't themselves feel comfortable teaching in a group, so they don't promote it. They promote one-to-ones. Also, parents sometimes have just had really bad experiences in the past. I mean, after COVID, I had to reassure a lot of parents, both from the online perspective and the group perspective, because they'd had some bad experiences. I still sometimes have to explain that that was an emergency situation. We all jumped online. We didn't really know what we were doing. Schools didn't have any notice, but it's very different now. And actually now I rarely have to have that conversation. So let's look into how you can really make sure that what you're doing and what you're communicating is aligned so that you're giving people that reassurance and that safety. Now, one caveat here is that, of course, a group environment won't be right for everyone. There is no one size fits all. But we're going to go with the assumption that a group environment is right for your subject and your target audience. Now, before I dive into the tips, I just want to mention that if you want detailed advice, guidance, strategies, then the Tutors Mastermind is the place to go. I have got specific training on there on attracting students to group classes. I have group class sales clinics that's recorded. Sometimes I run them periodically. And you get a 50% discount on the Launch, Teach and Fill group classes course. So head over to the Tutors Mastermind if you want something really structured that's going to get you results faster. It's www.tutorsmastermind.com. Okay, let's start with the big one, pricing. Now, how many times have you heard someone say, if you want to sell more group classes, make them much cheaper than your one-to-ones? In fact, that kind of advice is gospel in some circles. But here's the problem. When you lead with price, you're essentially communicating that this is the most important thing I want you to consider about what I'm offering. If you're communicating the pricing as that leading factor, the reason why someone should go for your group class, then you're not really giving them a chance to see the value that you bring to the table. Now, here's the truth. People don't want something because it's cheap. I recently spoke to two people who said that their parents are quite affluent, and so the cheaper group class price just isn't really appealing to them. They still want those one-to-ones. But quite honestly, if that's the feedback you're getting, or if your conversation is revolving around price, then pricing is playing a far bigger part than it should in your sales conversations. Now, something that might help is to understand at which point a sale happens. And this is with anything, not just group classes. A sale happens when the perceived value of what you're offering is actually greater than the investment, that's how people see it. So instead of trying to talk about how cheap your group classes are, you actually want to talk from a different angle. You want to talk about how it's worth every penny and more. So instead of slashing your prices, focus on communicating the value that you're bringing to the table. And I'm not talking about generic benefits here. Generic benefits won't connect with anyone. Talk about the things that you know matter to your audience. If that's through marketing, you might need a bit of guesswork. You might need to experiment. But if you're speaking to someone, that's a perfect opportunity to really find out what matters to them and then to communicate those benefits in a way that's really aligned. Now, of course, group classes are likely to be cheaper than your one-to-ones if you offer both. This is more a question of how much cheaper you're going to make it. And as we explore in the Launch, Teach and Fill group classes course that I co-developed with Charlotte Watson, there are a lot of nuances to this. There are a lot of factors to consider. Some people, quite rightly, have got quite a big difference. Some people don't. I don't, for instance, because there isn't that much difference between how I run my one-to-ones and my groups. My groups are extremely small. And so it means that what I'm offering is really tailored. Also, by making sure there really isn't much price difference, I'm not using pricing as a decision making factor. People aren't making their decision based on price because it doesn't make that much difference. Instead, we're having a conversation about exactly what's right for their child. So, regardless of how you do it, we have to remember that pricing is a communication tool. It shouldn't be the selling point, it should communicate something. So, some examples of where your pricing can communicate value might be where you've got a group writing class. Now, you're not just selling that this is cheaper than a one-to-one. You can talk about how it's an opportunity for students to collaborate, to gain knowledge from other people, to gain confidence in a really supportive environment, and to learn by observing their peers. A premium price, on the other hand, could signal exclusivity, higher quality materials, or your expertise as a tutor. Regardless, think about your pricing in a strategic way, not in a let me calculate how much money I'm going to get in my pocket way, because it goes such a long way to communicating what you want to communicate, and therefore it affects sales. So, next time you're setting prices, think about what you're portraying. What does your pricing say about your class without saying anything else? Are you positioning yourself as a discount store type thing or a boutique experience? Now let's talk about communication. Another piece of advice that gets thrown around a lot is keep talking about your group classes, keep promoting them, keep going, keep going. Now, if all you do is relentlessly sell or keep shouting about the same thing, it's going to be off-putting. Think about your experience as a consumer. I know you'll have someone at least in your audience who is just constantly selling and talking about the same thing and nothing else really. There are so many different ways to sell. You don't have to be quite as assaulting about it. You don't have to keep talking about the same thing in order to sell. We don't want that pick me or that desperate messaging. So, what can you do instead? So, what you really need is some variety. Think of it as serving up the same dish but with different seasoning each time. You can talk about your group class from so many different angles. So, for instance, you might share a success story of a past student. People love real world examples. You could talk about a specific problem that your group class has solved for one of your students, something maybe unexpected. So let's say, for example, you're talking about exam preparation. You might say how actually you helped one of your students with their time management skills. Show the benefits of that group learning environment and how you specifically teach in that group. So do you do things that promotes teamwork? Do your students go out into breakout rooms? Whatever you choose, and I'm using breakout rooms as the terminology, assuming you're teaching online. But if you're teaching face-to-face, you might put them in little groups. Regardless, show those really unique things that help people visualize what it might be like to learn with you. Show pictures. They don't have to be polished. In fact, the more raw they are, the better because they look real. Also, think about possible hesitations. So, for instance, someone might feel like their child is too shy for a group class. So, tackle that in your communication. Talk about the kind of things that you do to help students who might be feeling a bit shy. If you've listened to this podcast a while, you might remember me talking about this in another episode where I was in that situation once where a student was really, really shy. And so what I said to the parent was, well, I'll tell you what, how about we start each lesson with a bit of an icebreaker? And actually that stuck. It went down so well that I just carried on doing it. And it was just a discussion and That student who was really shy started preparing for my icebreaker. She was so excited before the lesson. It made such a big difference. And then I continued talking about it because there might be other students who are shy and their parents might think, oh, I don't know about a group class. Whereas me talking about those icebreakers gives them that reassurance. So you're preempting objections. So there's just a few ideas. The point is, keep it dynamic, keep your messaging really varied. Don't be relentless in your selling where people almost feel assaulted with information and that sales message. I'm all about building relationships and selling without being pushy. All right, so I have talked about two different areas in a bit of depth. Now I'm going to dissect some other common bits of advice that I see flying around. And the first one is to sell the benefit that they're cheaper. So I know I talked about, not leading with price, but here I'm actually combining two pieces of advice that I see a lot. The first one is keep talking about the benefits, keep talking about the generic benefits of group learning. And the second is about that cheaper thing, sell the fact that it's cheaper. I'm combining the two together. Now, benefits do sell. Of course they do. And people need to know features. Features are things like the logistics. They need to know that information. But there are a few nuances. Benefits actually need to be tied to outcomes. We can't just talk about generic benefits, and those outcomes need to matter to your audience. So instead of just saying you'll get personalized feedback, try something like you'll leave this class knowing exactly how to tackle the next steps in whatever it is you're talking about, whatever's relevant. You can say, no more guesswork. I'm going to teach you exactly how to think like an examiner, for instance. And remember that cheaper isn't actually a benefit, it's a trade off. When I talked about staying in control of sales conversations in episode 139, a key thing I mentioned was the importance of having conversations with potential clients and finding out exactly what they need and what matters to them and what they're thinking. Because when you know that, you can really frame the benefits to match what they're saying rather than being really generic and telling them things that they kind of don't care about. So it's about having tailored conversations. And the more people you speak to, the more you really learn about your audience. You can put this into your marketing as well. You don't just have to rely on having those individual conversations with people. The second piece of advice that I'm tackling is to give people a free trial. Now, this one's tricky because free trials can work. I know people, who use them really successfully, but they're not the only way to build trust. I've never given a free trial. In the 8 years I've run my tuition business, I haven't done a single one. So, for example, there are different ways where you could offer something like a free workshop or a mini resource, and that serves as a lead magnet. That way, you're still providing value, but you're not undervaluing your classes. You're not kind of making people who are paying for those classes feel a certain way. But look, if a free trial works for you, if you've been doing it for a while and it really works for you, just make sure that it's part of a strategy, that you've thought about what purpose it's serving and where you're taking people next. Be really intentional about it. You don't want that free class or that free trial to be your only hook. When I used to sell my larger group classes in 6-week blocks, instead of offering a free lesson or anything like that, because I used to record the classes, I actually created a kind of trailer, like a collage of snippets from those lessons. And I edited the video so that people knew exactly what I was talking about. So this is the way I do X, Y, and Z. This is how all the students participate in the lesson. And I would show a live snippet from the lesson. And I used to just send that to parents. I used to have it everywhere. I had it on my website, in my Facebook group when I had one for my tuition business. And it just did the job. I didn't have to offer anything else for free other than that little snippet because it was live. I couldn't fake that. They knew that they could watch that and get a true idea and vision of how I teach. Another piece of advice that I always feel a bit funny about is when people insist that you must sell in blocks. You shouldn't charge an hourly rate. Now, whether you sell in blocks or by the hour doesn't really matter because what matters is how you're constructing your charging. Are you absorbing costs? Are you taking into account the prep time that you have or marking and so on? So how you charge kind of doesn't matter when you have terms and conditions and As always, there are other factors at play. So, for instance, when I did run my 6 week blocks, I did charge in those blocks. And it had its pros and cons. I mean, great. I knew that I had X number of people for that block, but I had to do a lot of prep for that. The marketing was harder. I had to prepare the curriculum so that people knew what they were buying for those 6 weeks. The minute I changed how I do my group classes, so now they're very small, I curate them and they're very fluid. I don't have a preset curriculum because they're so small. I can keep them really tailored and really fluid according to what my students need. My parents pay me weekly. I charge by the hour, or at least that's what I'm communicating. I've taken everything else into account. And it's never been a problem. In fact, students stay with me longer now than they did with those 6 week blocks because I think there's a psychological element as well. When you have a block, you know that block's coming to an end. Whereas when it's just ongoing, there is no defined end date. And my students tend to stay with me for a very long time. I get to know families really well. So things like late payment and things like that really aren't a problem. I also have a bit of automation slipped in there to avoid issues like that. But if you like, selling in blocks or pay as you go or however you like to do it, a subscription, that's fine. Do what works for you. The reason why I'm talking about this isn't because I'm saying not to charge in blocks. The reason I'm talking about this is because I want you to be really open to all the different options that are available to you. I don't want you to be rigid and feel like you have to do it a certain way because this is the perception that other people in your community have got about certain methods. Do things your way, experiment, see how you find it, look at the pros and cons, and make decisions as you go along. You can change your mind anytime you want. I've done it so many times in my business. So don't be afraid of just going with something, seeing how it goes, and then just changing it later if you need to. All right, so to wrap up, here are some takeaways. The bottom line here is that selling groups, it doesn't mean that you have to sell yourself short. You don't have to make your groups really, really cheap. Now, of course, it depends on who you're targeting and so on, but you don't have to. That's not mandatory if you're going to sell group classes. There are lots of ways to go about it, and a lot of it is tied to how you're communicating what you offer. If you communicate, and I know that a lot of you are doing things that you don't talk about because it's just part of teaching. It's just something you do out of habit. But parents don't know that because they're not educators. So talk about those, what I call invisible benefits. Talk about the things that you wouldn't usually talk about. And it will really help you cut through the noise. It will help your group class really stand out. It will help people understand why they should go for your group class instead of someone else's, because actually there's more to it than join my group of 5 people or however many you might have in your group class. Really get into the bones and communicate in a way that people can visualize what the experience would be like. And price is a tool, so use it wisely. Remember to keep your messaging fresh. Talk about your group classes from different angles, sometimes slightly softer, sometimes you might be a bit more direct, but just keep it varied and interesting for your audience. And remember that this is your business. This isn't the business of a group of people in a Facebook group. It's your business. So do what feels right to you. Don't be afraid of making mistakes or not getting things right, because you can change things as they go along. You can continually improve things. Look, I've been running the Tutors Mastermind for a few years now, and this year, 2025, I'm making improvements. It's always developing, and that's okay. So thanks for tuning in, as always. And if you have a quick moment, please do leave a review. It helps me reach more people. I'm a small podcaster, so reviews really, really help. As always, you'll hear from me on Wednesday. Would you like to take this discussion further? Perhaps you have some questions or you'd like more ideas on tailoring your business. If so, book a free discovery call through the link in the show notes.